The last slide really just makes a few points about institutions. But does anybody have any points about the whole sort of package and power and money that you want to raise at this stage? You're all powered and moneyed out.
Is a lot of this money stuff, Cheryl, done outside the Constitution? As in, if you lay down the base principles, like Michael was saying about where property vests and who taxes, but then this complicated stuff is usually negotiated outside.
Well, it's been negotiated outside in our Constitution because we didn't see it coming, frankly. Our framers weren't very, they made a mess of the financial settlement. Perfectly clear. More recent constitutions have been a bit more effective with that. Some of them a little bit more nuanced in the way in which they divide taxing powers. So they try to use the same principles that we saw before for the division of ordinary powers and apply them to tax. So which taxes can effectively be raised at the state level? Which taxes need to be raised at the national level? And then they divide those accordingly. So that's one thing. But other things, like the principle of fiscal equalisation, is sometimes written into constitutions. So the point that Hassan made about how on earth do you persuade one state to give money to the other, well, one answer is the answer Michael gave, which is that, well, you know, the states themselves mightn't agree to do that, but you know, the federal government can make them do that if it's got so much money. But the other answer is to have the principle of fiscal equalisation in the Constitution. And Germany has that, Canada has that, and that's generated quite interesting and actually very useful court decisions. So you know, if I were drawing up a modern federal constitution, I would probably try to say something about that without saying too much, because you don't want to tie the system up in knots. So there is room for more of a framework for the fiscal stuff in a constitution, but it need only be a framework, and then you can leave it to legislation to set up the institutions. You can leave it obviously to legislation to do the taxing, and you may be able to put in place so this is another device the Germans use. They say, well, we're going to have an arrangement whereby most taxes are raised centrally. But we're going to say that the proceeds of these taxes will constitutionally be given to the states, and the proceeds of these taxes constitutionally go to the centre, and the proceeds of these taxes need to be shared, and you need to work out every 5 years or 10 years what the basis of the sharing is. So you can see they're trying to give some certainty, constitutional certainty, to the two levels of government. They're trying to provide some flexibility to deal with changing circumstances. So there's lots of different ways of dealing with this.
Yeah, in the case of, according to what has been agreed by the central government and the states, on 26th of May, just a week, probably 2 weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, say, for example, if a single cent that a particular state may raise, 55% of that dollar will go to the federal government or the central government. Then, whatever left, the 45 left, 10% will be given to the states that are not producing either oil or gas or maybe economically behind, which is fine. But isn't it the responsibility of the federal government to, given the fact that they're taking 55% of whatever one state may earn from oil or mineral, isn't that, can't we say it's the responsibility of the federal government to share the 55% that they took from a state A or B to actually support it to the other states?
Look, I can't answer that without knowing
No,
more about the figures and how it all works out.
Yeah.
I mean, you might depend, I mean, who knows, as far as I'm concerned. If the federal government's getting a good deal out of that, then the answer to that is maybe yes. But different federations deal with that differently too. So if I can again take you back to the Germans. Remember that we said before the break, before Michael came, that in Germany there's a rule that much legislation is passed by the centre but administered by the states. Now that is true of taxation also in Germany. So in Germany, most taxes, not all, but most taxes are legislated by the centre and they're collected by the states. Now in that situation, the states actually have the money from taxes, they have it all. And so they then have obligations to pay over to the centre what they're obliged under the Constitution to pay. But they also make the distribution to the poorer states from the state level. That's just the way it works out in that situation.
Who
So
tells
this-
them the number?
Huh?
Who tells them the number?
Who
Like,
tells-
how to give to that other, like,
It's,
you give it to WA.
there's an equalisation formula, and it's
So each of the separate states might trickle over some money to that
no,
poorer state?
it's much more organised than that. I can't quite remember now, but the guarantee of equalisation is in the Constitution. There's some understanding, I can't remember whether it's through legislation or some independent body, about what that involves from year to year. And then it becomes a proportionate thing. So if you're a rich German state and you raise oodles of money, then your equalisation responsibility might be bigger than that of a middle order raising state, I think. You know, it's something like that.
Once the principle probably is accepted, the mechanics will be easy.
No, this sounds complicated to me. I want one check if I'm Western Australia, not 5 checks from 5 states I don't trust.
No, but you do trust. I mean, that's not the point. Well, they do, anyway. I mean,
Western Australia doesn't trust us?
I mean, that's the other thing about the, you know, you do need some, I mean, Michael used the term solidarity. I mean, fiscal equalisation is a manifestation of solidarity. And that's what it's all about. So, you know, if you don't trust it, then don't use that system. Find another one that doesn't depend on trust. But they're perfectly comfortable with that trust.
However, Western Australia, you don't get that much from the fiscal appreciation because they are rich by themselves. So
Western Australia once used to be very, very dependent on fiscal equalisation. In fact, in 1900, Western Australia was getting a major payout. And so that's the irony of the present situation. Western Australia suddenly has become a donor state and is outraged at the development. And the rest of us are not sympathetic. However, you don't want to be here griping about Australia. Yes.
Of the 25 countries you mentioned with a federal system, is there one country that started unitary and then turned the federal?
Oh, quite a lot of them.
I see.
Yeah.
So Somalia is not the first.
Somalia is certainly not the first. In fact, and look, yeah, Somalia is certainly not the first. In fact, I don't think that in the world of the 21st century, there have been, you know, coming together federations for a long time. I mean, that's just not the way the world works anymore. So all the pressures are to decentralise from formerly highly centralised states. So while you're discussing all of this in Somalia, the Philippines is having exactly the same discussion. You know, how can we get power out of imperial Manila is the debate in the Philippines at the moment. They may or may not federalise, but they're seriously discussing doing it. South Africa did it in a sort of fairly centralised way as well. Myanmar is presently considering federalising.
The current tax system, while we're talking about tax in Somalia, is the best tax system because
Is what?
it's the best tax system. You know, the revenue, taxation revenue. You know, all these states, they keep their tax returns, and they ask the federal, just give us some more money. That's right.
Sounds like a state premier's dream.
Just did the 25 federal, was that the 25 federal systems or the 25 countries who use federal systems?
25 to 30, the figures vary, but 25 to 30 countries that have federal systems.
There's 25 different federal, then why would they have you? We'll try each one.
And there's an institution called the Forum of Federations, based in Canada, which has a website that lists them all and has click-through links and all sorts of things, if you want to do that. Okay, what do you think? Should one of you just quickly do that last slide, or should I stop now?
Please. No, it's
Stop at once.
Unless you want to have a break or so.
No, not at all. So look, what we've been doing today is talking about some of the very basics, federal system, that we covered this morning, really is just to try and get everybody thinking about what, as a matter of politics and culture, is involved in running a federal system. You know, all of this technical stuff is just drafting the Constitution, but you know, what it would involve to run a federal system. And then this afternoon, we've come back to somewhat more detail by trying to think about the principles for dividing power and the options for dividing money, including the ownership and management of resources. Now, of course, a federal system is just part of a larger set of constitutional arrangements. Each of those levels of government requires institutions. And so there's a whole lot of questions about what those institutions are and how they're designed. And there'll be other provisions in the Constitution, most obviously questions of rights and how you organise rights in a federal system. Now, all I want to do with this slide, and we're not going to go into institutions in any detail at this hour of night after a very busy day, but I just want to draw your attention to the institutions that you need to think about, point one, and point two, to say that you need to think about what difference it makes for the institutions to be in a federal system. The first dot point there makes the obvious point that follows from what we've said already, that you need institutions at both levels of government. So of course you need to think about how central institutions will be designed, but equally some thought needs to be given to what will happen at the state level. They don't have to be the same. It's not incredible to think that you might have a parliamentary system at one level and a presidential system at another. Generally speaking, the two levels do tend to sort of copy each other, but I think that's just habit rather than anything else. It is possible to have differences. And someone mentioned the Australian Republic briefly a moment ago. During the last round of the Republican debate, we looked as if we were heading for a situation where the Commonwealth would be a republic and the states were still monarchies. And nobody except me seemed to be at all fussed about it. So it just shows you get different arrangements at the two levels of government. And then the second point here, federalism may affect the form of structure of government. Equally, it may not. You may say, oh no, we for whatever reason, prefer a presidential system or a parliamentary system, and federal system will just have to adjust to it. So of course that's possible. There are federations around the world that are purely presidential, like the United States, and there's plenty of federations that are purely parliamentary. And I'm sure if I think hard enough, I'll think of federations that are semi-presidential. So it's not that as if one system of government automatically goes with federalism. But let's just think briefly then about each of the three branches of government. And this slide only deals with the three main branches, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. But very often constitutions also provide for other sorts of bodies, ombudsman, human rights commissions, fiscal commissions, etc., etc. And you might have a country in which you only have those institutions at the national level, but more likely in a federal system you will repeat those institutions. So if you look at Australia, for example, there's a national ombudsman, there's a Victorian ombudsman, there's a New South Wales ombudsman. Why? Because they're performing different sorts of functions in those two different levels of government. So we're not going to talk about all these other bits and pieces, but you know that they exist, and they may or may not be needed in Somalia. Now, the obvious choices for the executive branch are between presidential systems, where the legislature is completely separate from the president, parliamentary systems where the government depends on the support of the legislature, and then this combination system, semi-presidential, where you have both a president, usually a directly elected president, and a prime minister, with the president not dependent on the support of the legislature, but the prime minister living a very uneasy life trying to keep both the parliament and the president on side. Now those are the three broad choices. There are a few other systems around the world, but those are the three that people normally use. But within each of those descriptions, there's many different variations, particularly with the semi-presidential system. There's so many different variations of how you tweak the powers as between the president and the prime minister that frankly it does my head in. But if at some later stage you want to pursue those questions in greater detail, then of course we can do that. There is one question in about how federalism feeds into these matters of executive design. In a parliament, you can sort of do what I was suggesting earlier today. You can make sure that your cabinet at least represents all different bits of the country, even if your prime minister necessarily comes from one particular place. It's a bit harder with a president. And generally, many federations have arrangements for choosing a president to ensure that the president has more than a simple majority support in the country or in the parliament, whatever the option is. And I think looking at the Somalian arrangements, it's that supermajority in the parliament that is how that comes into play. So there are some very many options for design of the executive system, generally described around three main models, and federal considerations that may feed into each of those. The legislature, again, there are some important questions about how you elect the legislature, and I know this is a huge issue in Somalia, so I won't go into that at this point. except to say that in most federal systems you do find bicameral legislatures with the second chamber representing the states in some way. Now, again, there are many different ways in which that might occur. Some second chambers are directly elected by the people, as is the case in Australia and the United States. But in that case, you see the, well, I'll come back to that. Some federal chambers are directly elected by the people. Some are chosen in some other way. Very often chosen by the governments of the states, for example, so that in that case the second chamber really does represent the state governments. And that's the German approach, and to some extent the South African approach. In some federal systems, the second chamber represents the states equally, no matter the size of the states. In other federations, the state representation in the federal chamber is weighted by state population. Again, big variations across the federal systems of the world. And the other big variation is in what you ask your federal chamber to do. Sometimes you just make it equal with the lower house. That's effectively the case with the United States Senate. It's very nearly the case with the Australian Senate. Sometimes, however, you give it more modified powers. So in the case of the German upper house, for example, it has veto powers only over things that matter to the states. So the fiscal deal, federal legislation taking away the state power to administer federal law. Those sorts of things really matter in the operation of the federal system. And the federal second chamber has veto power over those things, but not veto power over other things that just relate to running the country as a whole. And then you can have other federal chambers with relatively little final veto power at all, with probably the Canadian Senate as being an effective example of that. So we can't sort that out for Somalia now, but all I'm trying to do is to paint a picture for you of these various options for how you constitute your federal second chamber and what you ask it to do. And I think we could all do a lot better with our federal second chambers than we actually do. So that's a discussion maybe for the future. And then let me just finish off by saying something about judiciaries, which is almost where we started today. So, of course, every system of government needs a judiciary, federal or not, to deal with disputes between the people and to deal with disputes between people and governments. In a federal system, and so forget constitutional interpretation just for the moment, just think about the ordinary old judiciary. In a federal system, there are options for the way in which you do this, and I think somebody referred to that this morning, Sean, I think it was you. And again, there's all sorts of ways of managing this, but let me suggest that there are three main models. One is that you say, we have two levels of government, they've each got their own legislature, they've each got their own executive, and they should each have their own judiciary too. That's one way of doing it. Two separate sets of judiciaries, just as there are two separate sets of governments and parliaments. This is the United States model, where if you have a dispute that's purely a state dispute, say in Texas, makes its way up the state, the Texan court hierarchy, gets to the Supreme Court of Texas, that's the end of the matter. If it's got a federal element in it, or a federal constitutional element, sure, then it goes over to the other side and makes its way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. But if it's purely a state matter, it stays in the state court system. Australia has a variation on that. In Australia, we also have two sets of court systems. We have a state court system in Victoria, makes its way up to the Supreme Court of Victoria, and then there's a federal court hierarchy. They keep changing it, but whatever. Federal Magistrates Court, or whatever it's now called, Federal Court of Australia, and then the High Court of Australia. What's different about Australia is that at the end of the day, the High Court is a unifying court. So state matters can go up to the High Court, and federal matters can go to the High Court. So unlike the United States, where you used to have these two silos, in Australia you have the silos, more or less, but they're joined at the top by the High Court of Australia. Nevertheless, both of those examples are examples of both levels of government having their own court system. At the other extreme, you can have just a single court system managed by the national government. South Africa, I think, is more or less in this category. Sure, the courts are scattered around the country so that you find courts in each of the provinces, but they're managed entirely and funded entirely and appointed entirely, I think, by the national government and parliament. And then there's the halfway house, where you have a single court system, but the lower courts are managed by the states, so that the courts that ordinary people go to sort out ordinary problems are dealt with right at the state level, which again is an application of subsidiarity. And once you get to the higher, more appellate echelons, then you find those courts being managed by the federal level of government, or the central level of government. So you've got all three of those options really in federal systems, and clearly you can mix and match those bits and have variations on them. But those are essentially what you're playing with in designing a court system for a federation. Then you need to, in addition, to consider who is going to interpret and apply and enforce the Constitution. And you have two main options in the world as it presently exists. I'm sure there are rooms for others, but this is what we presently use. Either you use your ordinary court system, or you use a special court that you set up especially for the purpose. And there's a lot of countries that fall into both those categories. So Australia uses the ordinary courts. The High Court of Australia deals with constitutional matters as well as crime and tax and everything else. And moreover, if you've got a constitutional problem, you can start in the magistrates' court down the road if you want to. Probably not advised to start in the magistrates' court, which would faint with horror, but you can. And then make your way up through the court system till you finally get to the High Court. Canada's the same, the United States is the same, India's the same, Malaysia's the same. They all just use the ordinary court system for constitutional purposes. Then you have many countries of the world that have a specialist constitutional court, either regarded as part of the court system, as I think is the case in Somalia, reading your constitution, or established right outside the court system as a specialist body of some kind. And if you're going to use that mechanism, then you need to decide what is a constitutional matter that goes to this constitutional court, and what is the relationship that that constitutional court has to the other courts in the country. Now, that's a matter on which Tom has written at great length, including doing this wonderful policy paper for Sri Lanka, where they're considering exactly these questions. Will we use the ordinary courts or have a specialist constitutional court? I don't know if you want to add to that, Tom?
No, perfect summary.
But he is the expert, so if you want to think about how you do all of this, you should talk to Tom.
In many countries, I understand there is what they call customary law. How does this relate or interact with the constitution? In Somalia, it's even more complex. Yeah. We have a constitution, we have Sharia laws, we have customary laws, and more.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Look, it's a very good and complicated question, and actually Anna is our expert on
For what
this.
it's worth. It depends. So some constitutions expressly recognise
Yes.
the existence of customary laws.
yes.
They might provide institutions that then adjudicate customary matters, or they might be completely quiet about it and just leave custom to continue on as it's always done. You know, they don't involve, so right down at the local level, they just leave those customary institutions to operate, maybe with some recognition in a statute, but they don't try and intervene. So it depends on what might be important. I think the issues that I'm aware of most are in the Pacific, and then issues do arise when, say, your customary law conflicts with something in your constitution, most often the Bill of Rights.
Yes.
And then you've got some problems that you need to sort out. How you do that depends on what the constitution says.
One country that really tried to grapple with how you constitutionalise its customary law was South Africa. That if you can look at their constitution and you can see how they tried to work out a hierarchy, constitution, legislation, custom, and they've had some quite interesting court cases there too, trying to work out that.
I was just going to chime in and say, even though constitutional courts are not a sort of panacea, having a specialised constitutional court that only deals with constitutional matters can give them a better focus and training to sort of have a systematic and principled approach to these kinds of questions. Whereas if you have a Supreme Court, unless you have a specialised chamber within the court, you'll have generalist judges who are dealing with all kinds of matters and constitutional law. And so you just have you've extra expertise and constitutional judges dealing with these kinds of issues on a regular basis. It can be an advantage, but there are other disadvantages, but that's one advantage.
And if you are going to have a constitutional court in particular, you also need to think about who can take matters to the Constitutional Court. Now, who can raise problems before the Constitutional Court? Because if you're using the ordinary court system, then you'll probably use the ordinary court rules for that question. So that means that if I think I've been aggrieved by some step the federal government's made that is constitutional, even I can go and take a constitutional case to the court. Whether I'll win or not is another question. Whereas with constitutional courts, you need to give some thought to who has standing to bring the matter before a court. And I mention that because it's quite a narrow range of people who can take things to the Constitutional Court of Somalia, even if it was in existence. Okay, everybody, you've been very patient.
Cheryl, just one question. How kind of funding this to be advanced, modernized, blah, blah, blah. So if this is the case, I mean, if what I'm told is true, my understanding is, or my expectation is that Australia will follow up whether the programs that they funded is followed properly.
I wonder if that's true. Yeah, well, look, I mean, that's interesting. And maybe they do. But it depends what they think they're doing.
As you may know, Australia is a member of the Somali panel based in Kenya. When I say Somali panel, I don't mean Somalis, but the countries who support Somalia. That's Arab countries, European, American, blah, blah. And each one of them allocates some funding to a particular area for the sake of advancement of that particular area. So Australia has contributed some money to that area. Mohammed probably is more aware than I am, probably can give advice. So my point is, if this is what Australia is doing, I think it's their responsibility as well to follow up and check whether programs that they are funding is properly followed.
Perhaps, although it's very hard for them to really follow the money into the country. And it's a question what the program that they're funding is actually says it's doing. I mean, one of the things we try to do in ConTransNet is to say, we actually think that there are ways of doing these things that really want to engage the people who understand the problems on the ground. Whereas a lot of international donors think don't fully understand.
They more or less fund bilateral or multilateral. They just put some
Anyway, we can
resources
look
in
into
the middle.
When I go back to my OZ 20 years old OZ experience, there is no direct funding from OZ to Somalia. There are small funds available with the Australian Embassy in Nairobi of 10,000, 5,000, 15,000 max, paid at the discretion of the ambassador. And these go usually to small institutions, maybe NGOs or what have you. So there is no direct funding, but Australia does contribute to United Nations organizations, to AMISOM, to many other multilateral institutions, to OZ.
Yeah.
At
But
least
unfortunately, it's not in our hands. If you could think of any way of putting it in our hands, we would do it. However, we need to draw this to a close. And can I ask that you start thinking about what you would like to do with the discussions we've had today and where you would like to take them. So Mohammed, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you. I think first of all, I want to thank you, and it's been a very informative, educational, very useful, productive day. Really, there's so much to learn and to absorb. I think it will take us days just to digest all the knowledge, so that was quite amazing. Very much on behalf of the Somali community members here, and also the team, so on, so thank you very much. I think, yeah, where to from here? I think I can see our discussion while you were not with us before, there's a bit of excitement about this process. In fact, what I didn't tell you was there were a few other things we were doing with Monash and Deakin and Swinburne for different reasons. And there was one about Somali election, there's one about cybersecurity, the reason I went to Samoa and so on. There's one about terrorism with Deakin folks. But the reason we approached you, and I'm grateful you accepted and you helped us with this, was believing in how much knowledge was available here, and that has been proven beyond our expectation and what we were expecting. Now, the challenge for us now is where to from here, where do we go from this? First of all, I'll come back to you in a bit more formal way after we have our own discussion after this. But the one that more or less we can predict is the follow-up. I think that just have to happen. I think this is too good not to do it. But how we will do it in a good format and whether we can get input from the Somali government and other entities, that's what we need to discuss. The other issue that I really want to think about is a way of summarizing what we talked about today and coming up with, I don't know what we will call, discussion paper or communique or something that we can share with our folks back home as well. And it could be even a summarized version of our discussion, as he was saying, these are the issues we discussed, and these are the options available, just for information. And I'm sure people will appreciate, especially my folks back home in the government and so on. As you all heard, the challenges are too big, the elephant, but we have to get one piece at a time, and I think we started today. So what we'll do, we have an email now that we have everyone's account. So we'll continue the discussion online and so on. After Ramadan, we'll get together again, hopefully approach you and agree on when we can do the follow-up. But I'm just overwhelmed with how much knowledge and information we gained today. And I'm sure I'm talking on behalf of everyone here. So first of all, I want to thank you, and then I think as we move forward, it will be interesting to see if a way we can formalize with the CTN. I'm now beginning to understand. For some reason, after all this time, It's only making sense to me now. So, or maybe not yet, so, but.
No.
But if we can take advantage of that network, I think it would be useful. Because as you noticed, one of our challenges is the knowledge gap. The people who are dealing with the Constitution and a lot of other technical stuff. And that's basically what we inherited after 25 years or 30 years of no formal education and all those other problems. So again, I'll come back to you and see how we can take advantage of that and what we can put together. So that's really where I want to stop. It's been a long day for you and for everyone here, and I'm very grateful for all the people who turned up, although it's Ramadan and all the energy, but I just can't thank you more. I think that's on behalf of everyone. Thank you.
Can I just say that on behalf of all of our team, that we very much enjoyed meeting you. It's been a real privilege to have you come here, and I know it's a big thing to take a whole day out of your lives, particularly towards the end of Ramadan. We've learned a lot, and really welcome keeping up the discussion. Please come back to us with your thoughts. I completely understand that you need to go away and pull all of this together in your own heads. If you have further queries that you'd like to put to us by email, we're more than happy to answer those. And otherwise, we look forward to hearing from you and what you know what to do next. So, thank you.
Thank you.